Hi, and welcome to another episode of Ends Division. I'm Glenn Reynolds. Well, he really needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway, because that's how we roll here. Jonah Goldberg is the editor-at-large of the National Review. He made a big splash with his first book, Liberal Fascism, which was a great big bestseller and still selling like hotcakes. And now he's got a new book out called The Tyranny of Cliches that's likely to make a big splash as well. Welcome, Jonah. Glad to have you here.
Hey, Glenn, it's great to be here. I'm happier than Helen Thomas at a Hamas rally.
Well, that's happy. So liberal fascism was like a monumental work of deep research. With The Tyranny of Cliches, it's more like you're just sort of batting down stupid ideas one at a time. Why did you decide to put out this book now?
Well, you know, in some ways, it's not a sequel to liberal fascism, but you know, I learned a lot while working on liberal fascism, and one of the things I learned was how people use the word fascist to mean all sorts of things it's not, right? And to win arguments without having to make an argument. I still say the best working definition of a fascist in American politics today is simply a conservative who's winning an argument. You know, people call you a fascist or a racist or a homophobe or a social Darwinist to shut you up. And this book was a sort of a way to sort of follow that argument up on a whole bunch of other fronts. Because the core argument of this book is that conservatives and libertarians are ideological, and they admit it, right? I mean, we like to argue about theory. We like to argue about our intellectual history. We like to argue about Ayn Rand and Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and we wear Edmund Burke ties and all that kind of stuff. We love the libertarian versus conservative arguments. We get into all the dogma. Liberals have a completely different orientation with their own intellectual history. They will not admit that they are ideological. They always say, I'm just a pragmatist. I only care about what works. I don't believe in labels. And this is what social scientists call a big friggin' lie. That they are in fact just as ideological as everybody else, but they lie to themselves and they lie to everybody else in the process about it. And so what I try to do in this book is have a little fun. Well, and part of it is they want to believe it. I mean, they truly want to believe it. They want to believe, as Jonathan Chait calls it, they're fact finders, they're empiricists. They believe that they have a monopoly not just on political virtue, but on the facts, right? And some of this is, you know, this vestigial sort of backwash from Marxism with this idea of scientific socialism and all of the rest. Some of it comes from American pragmatism, which is a big subject in my book, the philosophical school of pragmatism. But also it's just a way to also delegitimize conservatives, right? I mean, they always say, oh, you're just an ideologue. I don't have to take you seriously. It's a way to say that everybody else who is honest about having ideological principles can be dismissed because the only serious people are the ones who lie about not having any. And the other reason I wrote this book now is, you know, look, liberal fascism, I'm very proud of the book. I'm proud of its impact and all of the rest, and I'm glad I wrote it first. But it was not an opportunity to have any fun, you know? You just can't, there's not a lot of chances to say, hey, you know, funny thing about the Holocaust, right? And so it had to be a serious and sort of sober book. And this, there are a lot of serious and sober arguments in it, but it allows me to have a little more fun and tell a few more jokes and entertain the reader more, which I actually think is pretty important for conservatives.
Yeah, it is. It's actually quite a fun book, and in places it even reminded me of P.J. O'Rourke, which I think is pretty high praise. Well, let's walk through a few of some of the cliches you're talking about. What's your favorite cliche that you blow up in the book?
Well, you know, there are a bunch of different kinds of cliches, right? Some of these things are, I mean, part of the argument is that because liberals are ideological but won't admit it, their ideological positions manifest themselves in these cliches, right? I mean, conservatives use cliches too, but we also admit that we're conservatives or libertarians or what have you. Liberals won't admit it, and so they actually end up taking these radically ideological positions masquerading in these Trojan horses of these truisms and whatnot. And some of them are ones that we all buy into, right? I mean, one of the examples I use in the very beginning is just this concept of the center. We all sort of see the center as this incredibly privileged and wonderful place, right? The mainstream media constantly talks about the center as if it's just the greatest place in the world and that centrists are somehow wiser and more noble than the rest of us. Shh, shh, David Gergen's about to talk, right? I mean, it's that kind of thing. And it's all nonsense. For first of all, the whole idea of the center as being this privileged place is actually one of these Enlightenment myths, right? There's this whole slew of argumentation about how Galileo and Copernicus dethroned mankind by getting rid of geocentrism, right? That when the theory of heliocentrism, that we revolve around the sun rather than the earth being the center of the world, was a elevation or a promotion for mankind, and in our arrogance we couldn't handle it, and that's why the Catholic Church beat it up on it. And the reason why it's one of my favorites, it's not a real left-right thing, except in the regard that it sort of explains how we understand the whole geographic political landscape. The reason why the Catholic Church and pretty much everybody else opposed geocentrism was, one, they weren't sure the science was right, because it was a novel theory at the time, but two, because they considered it a promotion. In medieval understanding, in ancient Greek understanding, in Jewish medieval understanding, and Catholic Thomas Aquinas understanding, the center of the world, the center of the universe, is literally the asshole of the universe. It is literally, I don't know if I can say that, there's no FCC here, right? But the center of the universe is considered, the center of the universe is considered the lowest and most disgusting and turgid place in the whole cosmos. In Dante's Inferno, the lowest pit of hell is in the center of the universe. Maimonides talks about this, Aquinas talks about this, and it is this myth of the modern mind that somehow geocentrism, getting rid of geocentrism somehow elevated mankind. It completely misunderstands where the medieval mind was, and we carry it forward to today, right? I have a lot of, there are huge arguments we have with the left, or between the left and the right? The left says we have to build this bridge over a canyon, right? It's a stimulus thing, it's infrastructure, we need this bridge. The right says, are you friggin' crazy? We can't afford it, we don't need the bridge, it's a bridge to nowhere, it makes no sense, blah, 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 blah. That's an honest argument. One side says let's build the bridge, the other side says let's not build the bridge. The friggin' pinky extending centrists parachute in and says, no, let there be peace among you. We'll compromise. We'll build half a bridge that goes halfway across the canyon, right? Is these different splitters who drive me absolutely batty, and we treat them as if they hold this privileged place when we don't even understand that the center is a geographic metaphor. It's not an actual place in politics. All of the serious ideas in politics have always come from where they were considered to be the extreme at one point or another.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think journalists privilege the center because they imagine that they're in the center and that they're sort of the fulcrum holding the balance of power on stuff. So that's I think why they think it's such a privileged place. But of course, they're not in the center at all. They just like to be. What about this idea that violence never solves anything?
What's my problem with violence never solves anything? Well, first of all, it's incandescently stupid, right? It's something, and again, it's a radical proposition masquerading as this sort of almost biblical truth and wisdom. And it's, first of all, it's nonsense. Violence solves lots of problems, particularly violent problems, right? You ever see a cop outside of a bank robbery and the place is being held up and he's about to go in and stop the robbery, and then he looks at his gun and he's like, damn, this thing's useless, and throws it away, right? Moreover, it has always been used, this idea of violence never solved anything, right? It's almost always been used as a way to stop good guys in the West from stopping bad guys in the rest of the world, right? We don't get it from Jesus. Jesus told his followers to carry swords. Why would he tell them that if swords can't solve anything, right? We basically get it from Gandhi, who said that violence only offers short-term solutions, always long-term problems. And at least he was somewhat consistent about this insofar as, although he always used it against the West, he never used it against the East, but he was consistent about this to the point where he embraced the argument ad absurdum about it, right? His advice to the British was to surrender unilaterally to Adolf Hitler. He called Adolf Hitler his friend, wrote him an open letter calling him his friend, but he told the British, give up your homes, give up your pretty buildings, give up your beautiful island, but save your integrity. That's really helpful advice. He told the Jews, the best way you could deal with the problem of the Holocaust and the Nazis is to commit mass suicide, because that'll really show them. And meanwhile, in the modern day, people who say violence never solved anything, they never say it to denounce, Saddam Hussein killing his own people or the Chinese torturing and killing their own people. They only ever say it when anybody in America proposes using, or in the West, proposes using force to stop bad guys from doing horrible things. And so it's an appeal to the Western conscience. Orwell writes beautifully about this. There were no Gandhis that we know of in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, because in those countries, you say something like violence never solves anything, you end up in the gulag in the middle of the night.
Yeah, I think it was Lenin who said you can't fight an idea, but you can kill the man who holds the idea, and that's good enough. And that was certainly their philosophy. Of course, I'm Scots-Irish. We just believe that there's a certain class of people in the world that just need killing. And so Gandhi never really took hold among my people so much. Well, here's another one. How about this one? That religion is to be suspect, but that spirituality is good. Talk about that.
Right. This is one of my great personal peeves. You hear this all the time from people. I don't believe in religion. I'm a deeply spiritual person. And in one sense, look, that's fine. You should have Ross Douthat come on and explain his book. He goes into this in a much more serious and scholarly way for an entire book. But the general gist of it, and Jonathan Haidt has a lot of this in his book, The Righteous Mind. Basically, we are hardwired to be religious people. We are homo religioso, as the philosopher Will Herberg put it. I have no problem with people if they want to describe themselves as spiritual and all the rest. What I have a huge problem with is people who describe themselves as spiritual who simultaneously have nothing but contempt and scorn for organized religion. As if in institutions that have organized themselves around spirituality, have thought through its connotations for sometimes thousands of years, and how to channel it to bring out the best in people and all the rest, that is somehow suspicious and dangerous and iffy. But someone who basically makes up their spirituality off the cuff, inhales their spirituality out of a bong, that somehow this is something that needs to be deeply respected. You have Madonna, who says that that she's embracing Kabbalah. If you know any Jews who know anything about Kabbalah, ask them how ridiculous this is. Rabbis who spend their lives studying the Talmud, right? Spending day and night arguing about why God said that the sun should set at 7:38 on a Wednesday and not 7:37 on a Wednesday, who study the commentaries endlessly. They are not allowed to look at the Kabbalah until the age of 40 because they consider it to be so complicated and complex. But Madonna thinks that she can just sort of master it while she's getting a mani-pedi or something. And it's this kind of thing that I just find so contemptible. And in the popular culture, we are constantly locking out the Catholic Church, organized Judaism, all the rest, from the people's imaginations as sources of spirituality and the rest. The movie Avatar was one endless friggin' 3D cliche about the noble savages. It was basically Pocahontas in space, right? Or Dances with Aliens. And that's all fine to a certain extent. It wasn't original by any stretch of the imagination. What would have been incredibly original is if instead of tree-worshipping, 7-foot-tall Indians, that the spiritual aliens who are morally superior to us and who are one with nature, it would have been much more interesting and exciting a movie if they were all Hasidic Jews, right? And that would have been interesting. But instead, they have to go with these same tropes that make Western man look like a bunch of meat-eating crypto-fascists, because that just reinforces their own view of themselves.
It is interesting that all of this, there seem to be certain sort of narrative threads that almost might have been created by propagandists who wanted to destroy the West 50 or 100 years ago, and that have been woven into art so that they become standard themes that people aren't even suspicious of when they see them, despite what the message is. My short description of spirituality versus religion is that religion might tell you not to do something you want to do, whereas spirituality will always tell you to feel good about whatever it is you've done, and that's why people embrace one rather than the other.
That's a good way to do it. We basically make our instincts our scripture with the spirituality thing.
Yeah, which is not really consistent with the general thrust of organized religion. So what's wrong with a living constitution?
Well, where to start? Okay, so one of my favorite quotes, which I don't have it handy with me, but one of my favorite quotes in the book, if people have a chance to look for it, there's a great paragraph from Herbert Crowley, who's, as we know, plays a big part in liberal fascism, founder of basically the American Progressive Movement, founding editor of the New Republic, author of The Promise of American Life, advisor to TR and Wilson. I mean, he is the indispensable man of the progressive era, right? And he's got this great description of what Lady Justice should look like. The old Lady Justice is blind. She has a sword in one hand and a scale in the other, and she's supposed to weigh justice, not without favor or anything like that. And he describes what Lady Justice should look like in the era of the living Constitution, and it is a mix of like Inspector Gadget and Granny Clampett. It's this woman with these telescoping binocular eyes who's got a rake that she's going to rake the garden of social justice. She's going to be able to see into the distance to find cases of justice where the courts will intervene to help people and all of the rest. And what's useful about it is that at least Crowley was honest about what he had in mind about the living Constitution. Liberals who talk about the living Constitution today, they deny that there's anything illegitimate or contrary to what the idea of justice properly understood is, right? Basically what it is it's Felix the Cat's magic bag. If a liberal looks in there long enough, deep enough, and hard enough, he'll find whatever he wants in the Constitution. But if a conservative looks in there and finds anything that favors him, it's judicial activism or it's craziness and all of the rest. At the end of the day, the arguments that drive me the most batty about the living Constitution, because there's a lot to be said about it, and you're a law professor and you know more about this stuff than I do. But at the end of the day, the arguments that drive me the most batty about it is whenever conservatives talk about change, let's put it this way, the argument you hear from liberals is the Constitution needs to change over time, that it needs to sort of take account of the changing nature of technology and all the rest. The Founding Fathers could never have imagined Skype and airplanes and rising crust frozen pizza, and so therefore we have to breathe new life into the Constitution and all of the rest, right? And at the same time, like during the Patriot Act stuff, the second conservatives say, hey, we have these new enemies, these non-state actors who can get their hands on weapons of mass destruction that we've never had before, and that requires us to think more creatively about how we deal with this threat. All of a sudden, that's the first time that you get liberals taking to the floor of the Senate and the House, extolling the genius of the Founding Fathers and how he who would sacrifice his liberty for security deserves neither, was all of a sudden the favorite quote from all of these guys. It was a Ben Franklin quote. Or like when conservatives say, hey, you're right, the Constitution does need to be changed because times have changed and we need to deal with some problem or another, but we have to change it constitutionally, so let's amend it. And then immediately, liberals come out and say, how dare you want to tamper with the genius of the Founding Fathers? Who are you to tinker with the glorious structure of the Constitution? It is always heads they win, tails we lose when it comes to this stuff, because the Constitution, at the end of the day, the living Constitution, is really just a magic talisman to empower sort of a progressive will to power.
Well, yeah, I think it's very much like the religion spirituality thing. In fact, the Constitution might keep you from doing what you want, but a living Constitution always lets you do what you want and then gives you a club to beat the rubes over the head with by telling them, hey, the Constitution says we can do this.
Right.
So it's very similar. Actually, I think my next law review article may be called The Living Constitution for the 21st Century, and I'm going to say that, in the 30s, we were supposed to have learned a lot of lessons about the failure of capitalism and the need for government. And now, 80 years later, the lessons we've learned is you can't trust the government with your money or your freedom, and they all need to have their hands chopped off and be pushed back the way they were. And who can argue, right? The life of the law has not been logic, it's experience. Holmes said it.
That's right. That's right. As Edmund Burke said, example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it none other.
There you go. All right, last question. What do you want people to take away from this book?
A burning, yearning need to buy more copies of it. No, what I'd like for people to do is understand this trick, right? I mean, cliched thinking is a problem everywhere. I mean, that's really true. I think Orwell was absolutely right. It was sort of like when you're talking about movies. You know, there are these just tropes that we all buy into. Orwell has this great line about how cliches sometimes end up doing our thinking for us, right? We buy into these little heuristic algorithms, and we just get sucked into thinking along certain channels. And that's a problem for everybody, and I think people should take away that. But in particular, I would like it to, if it could sort of be a die marker, right, where it lights up certain species of liberal argument, certain species of left-wing argument, where they try to seize territory unearned by argument, right? That what they're really trying to do is box you into this cliched way of thinking about things, and not just about some partisan stuff and all of the rest. I mean, I'm not talking about bumper stickers and or even Obamacare necessarily and that kind of stuff, but some of these cliches, like the thing about the center, right, or being on the right side of history, or the slippery slope. There is some deeply deterministic, almost Marxist or Hegelian ideas buried in these seeming truisms, that the wheel of history always has to move forward, always has to be pushed by the state, that we are sort of slaves to our destiny, and that's just simply not true. There is no such thing as a slippery slope if you won't let it be a slippery slope. T.S. Eliot had it exactly right. There's no such thing as a truly lost cause, because there's no such thing as a truly won cause. As long as there are people on the other side of the argument who aren't willing to lie down and give up, then there's still a chance for victory. And there's a lot of fatalism on the right. There's a lot of this sort of today was worse than yesterday, and tomorrow is going to be worse than today. This idea that things only get worse, and that's nonsense. There are all sorts of things, thanks largely to the influence of conservatives and really libertarians, over the last 30 years that have made this a better and stronger country. We've had lots of victories. The Constitution is more important now to more people because of arguments that were started basically under Ronald Reagan and by the Federalist Society. Now the Constitution is a friggin' populist movement because of the Tea Parties. That is huge progress. And the first trick to sort of making this kind of real progress, not in a progressive sense, but I mean in terms of social improvement and restoration and all of the rest, is to understand that you shouldn't let them frame the argument for you, that you shouldn't let them herd you into a cliched way of thinking, that you should try to think for yourselves and understand that this is a good and noble fight, that we have great arguments on our side, and they're trying to avoid having arguments.
Well, thanks so much. I think that's right. And of course, we always try to avoid cliched thinking here at Instavision. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Hey, Glenn, it's always a pleasure. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And that was Jonah Goldberg. He's editor-at-large of National Review, and his first book, Liberal Fascism, made a really big splash, but his new book, The Tyranny of Cliches, is likely to make an even bigger one. Buy it now at Amazon.com and find bookstores everywhere. Well, that's it for this episode of Instavision. We'll be back in the future. In the meantime, have fun on the internet. Thanks.